Hello, we are doing chapter 3 on I Am a Member by Tom Rainer. So this particular book is stepping on some toes. I already heard somebody say that, and that's good. I'll be honest, I'm glad. As lovingly as I can say that, I'm glad. I think it's always healthy for us to have our toes stepped on, including myself. There's times when I've listened under a pastor or in a group Bible study or something, and just something hits you and you're just like, oh man, do I feel awful now. It's a horrible feeling to realize that you've been wrong, but what a wonderful way to learn, right? Because it's those moments of that you always remember, and that's what we grow from. I used to always tell my students, you learn and grow out of the struggle. It's only in those struggles that we grow. So as we go through this book, and if something really hits you, and you might get really mad at it, but just know that's the Holy Spirit working on you. And it might, as all discipline does, it's going to hurt a little bit. When you get that whack on the hiney, it hurts a lot. But from that whack, you grow from that, and you become more mature. So here's the flip side of that. If you read through this book and you didn't get any toes stepped on, and you're like, I don't remember feeling that, you didn't probably read it close enough, so you should probably go back and read it again. But anyway, all right, chapter 3. I will not let my church be about my preferences and desires. Possibly the most important chapter. I don't know. Honestly, that might be a discussion later. We could rank them later. I love his illustration. He opens up because he wants to talk about his kids, and then he realizes that he acts just like kids. I find that hilarious because I've been in the same boat where you're getting onto your kid and you realize that they're just doing what you used to do, and sometimes some of us still do it. I always catch flack for this, or not always, but there's a lot of times I catch flack for this statement. I'll say it again anyway because it's still true. Adults are just kids with older ages and older bodies. It's the same thing. What kids do that we get annoyed about, grown adults do the same thing, and nobody's been able to prove it differently. I've had people argue, but they've not proven differently. So there you go. So as we talk about membership, though, he says in the middle of 34, but the strange thing about church membership is that you actually give up your preferences when you join. Right? Now that's a strange statement for modern Christianity. But I just kicked the camera. All right, we're gonna fix that and we'll just leave that in. All right, that's a strange statement for modern Christianity, right? Because in our consumer-driven culture, a lot of times we're told, you should choose a church that helps your family, or we choose churches based on are my needs met. That's always one of the big ones, right? Is, well, I don't know if I'm getting anything by attending the church. And he just tells right there, right, that you actually give up your preferences when you join. You were there to serve others. You were there to give. You were there to sacrifice. And that's a hard reality for a lot of people to understand, that when we join a church, we are not joining, or we should not be joining, because of what the church can do for us. We're joining because of what we can do for the church. Now, that doesn't mean we go in with an attitude of arrogance and I know what's right and I'm going to clean this place up. It just means simply that we have to figure out, how can we help with what's going on? What is God doing there in that church, and how can I plug in and be a part of that? That's the goal, is we want to do what God has called us to do, and the task that he's called us to do within that local church. And then he talks about in Mark 9:35, he calls the 12, right? Because you got the two disciples that are arguing over who's going to be the greatest, or how do you get to be the greatest. By the way, there's one version of that story where their mom actually steps in, which that is just hilarious, as we like to talk about millennials and their moms being helicopter moms and all that. That was happening in the first century too. So there you go. Anyway, but he tells them, Jesus sits them all down, and I love how he writes this. The Bible says that Jesus stopped and sat down and called these grown men together. How often do we have to call in grown people together and talk to them like they're little kids? Anyway, it says, if anyone wants to be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. Right? If we want to be first in the kingdom, we have to serve others. It is not a power-hungry thing. This in other places he says, don't be like the Gentiles and lord over your authority, but serve one another. Serve them. So he says that, this text is for him. As a church member, my motivation should not be to get my preferences to the top of the list. I'm supposed to be last, not first. And then he goes into service. And now let's just sit there for a second, right? That it is not our preferences, my individual preference, even as a pastor, it's not my individual preference that should dictate what the church does. We're to serve one another, and we're to serve with what is happening within that. Now, that doesn't mean we never change anything. It just means that as we're going about and as we're influencing and as we're, in the case of church leaders, as we're leading people towards a change that might be very necessary, we have to remember that we're doing this out of love and service. So if I were, and just think about it, if I were to come in, with a bulldozer attitude, we're just going to get rid of everything and rebuild, it would not go over well. And in our church's history, we know it didn't go over well because somebody tried to do that, right? So you just can't do it. And as much as we pick on pastors who try to do such things, what about individual members that do the same thing, right? They may not come in with a bulldozer and say this is the way it's going to be, but dadgum if they don't, keep a bulldozer attitude about it. And that's what this chapter is about. So the word servant occurs 57 times. It's very important. That's what he gets there. And then Paul even talks about being a servant of the gospel. And then he gets into this survey. And if you Google any number of surveys about unhealthy churches, healthy churches, dying churches, growing churches, pick a phrase, Google it, you're going to see the same motifs over and over and over again. There's actually been a couple books I've read in the past. One is Why Churches Die. That was really good. There's one called God's Frozen People. I'm pretty sure it's out of print now, but if you find a copy of it, that one's pretty good too. But what you see is that attitude of self and what I want. That's kind of the overarching problem. But in his survey, he goes through 10 things that they see, and one is worship wars. And as I read these, and as you read these, maybe go back and read it again. I would strongly encourage you to reflect on years past that you've been at your church. And if you're at Chilhowee, then you can take this as a mandate. You got to do it, right? How have you seen these attitudes in your church, right? Have they played out in some ways? And if you have seen them, would you say that the church is over it, or is this still an issue, right? So the first one is worship wars. The order of service has to remain constant. Any deviation gets anger and demands for change. I remember when I changed the bulletin, and I jokingly said things to some of my friends about, we'll see if this lasts and that sort of thing. And it was all in jest because honestly, it's one of those things you never really know how it's going to work out. But there have literally been fights in churches between leadership and congregants over how the bulletin should look or what the order of service should look like. There was a guy in one of our pastors groups talking about he had somebody. It was the first time, and I forget how long he'd been a pastor, but first time somebody came to him and said, "This is the way the order of service should be." Now, as the senior pastor, when you're told things like "this is the way this should be," most people's instincts are probably like mine. They're like, I don't care. That's not, no. You just kind of, because you're just like, what? No, how dare you? Like, what are you thinking? But on the flip side, and some people think, well, no, they should just keep it the same, and they should serve. That's how you serve your people, is you just keep things the same. Well, that's not healthy either. Like, you don't want a pastor who doesn't have a spine. That would be useless. But anyway, so worship wars, right? How does that work? 2, prolonged minutia meetings. I've been in some churches where I'm not even sure how often they actually met because things were just done. It was just one of those, like, people had jobs to do, they did it, and all was well. Been in some where they had to talk about everything under the sun forever, and it took forever. But notice the main point there. He says most of the meetings deal with most inconsequential items, while the Great Commission and Great Commandment are rarely the topics of discussion. I would say you can't just rule out meetings altogether, but at the same time, what is taking up the time in these meetings? Are we talking about how we're fulfilling the Great Commission or the Great Commandment, or are we talking about stuff that probably could have been sent out in an email or something and been done with it? 3, facility focus. one of the highest priorities in the church is the protection and preservation of rooms, furniture, and other visible parts of the church's buildings and grounds. Now, that's a good way to split a church, right? Like, just talk about changing the carpet or the walls or something, and you'll get all kinds of upheaval. And it shouldn't be that way. That's the point of his book, right? We laugh about it because we're like, yeah, that's right. It shouldn't be right. That's the point. 4, program driven. This is a hard one, man. This is a real hard one. Because here's the thing: every church has programs, even if they don't admit it, right? So what he means by that is every church, right? When we have to decide how it is that we're going to do something or what it is that we're going to do, that becomes a program. It becomes a way of doing it. So things like VBS, Awana, Sunday school itself, right? Sunday night services / Sunday night Bible study. These are programs. These are things. There's a schedule to them. There's a formula or a template to them, and so that becomes a program. Now, some programs they live on for it feels like eternity. VBS feels like it's been going on forever. It hasn't. It really hasn't. But it was such a great thing that a lot of churches developed that it's become a staple and a tradition. And there's nothing wrong with VBS so long as it's fulfilling the purpose that it's supposed to fulfill. Awana has actually garnered almost as much of I hate to say market share, but I can't think of another word, like a market share in churches in terms of how they work. Because if you look at different types of children's programs, like if you just Google that, Awana gets up there pretty quick. And it's because they've had a lot of success with it. It's done some good things. And again, there's nothing wrong with Awana. It's a great program insofar as it's fulfilling its task in the local church. Sunday school is another one, right? Some of y'all may not believe this, but Sunday school is actually relatively new in terms of history. It's been around for a while now, but it's a program, and it's done its job well, and it's continued to do its job well. So churches continue to do it. However, some churches now have adopted a different type of Sunday school. Of course, when you get a different type, you got to give it a different name. So they'll call it like small groups and things like that. And so, but at the end of the day, right, to have a small group of people studying the Bible, praying for one another, loving one another, like however you call that, that's always a good thing. That's actually in Scripture that we should be doing that. We should be gathering in small groups to hold one another accountable. So whether we do that in Sunday school, life groups, home groups, mini churches, micro churches, blah, 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 whatever other plethora of terms that are out there. Wherever 2 or 3 or more are gathered in Jesus' name, he is there, and that is a good time. That's the bottom line. So what gets people fighting, though, is should that happen on Sunday morning before service? Should it happen Sunday morning after service? Should it happen Sunday night? Should it happen during the week? When should it happen? How can they happen? Who can choose when it can happen? What do we do when we go there? What curriculum do we use? All these questions get churned out. Well, that's the type of programs. And if your attitude is that the program that I want, the way I want it, is the way we should do it, he's telling you that is not biblical. And I am telling you I agree with that. That's not biblical. You should not do that. And I'll go ahead and tell you, challenge you to look in the Bible to find out where your particular program is in the Bible, and that's the way you should do it. But anyway. All right, inwardly focused budget, right? A disproportionate share of the budget is used to meet the needs and comforts of the members instead of reaching beyond the walls of the church. This one's a hard one, right? I had a pastor a long time ago, I remember saying, show me your checkbook and I'll show you where your heart is. You can say the same thing about churches, right? If you look at a church's budget, you can figure out where their priorities are in the budget. And that's a hard one, because for some churches that don't have giant budgets, I mean, that percentage of maintaining the church, it does take a large percentage, but it's because it has to, because of utility costs, et cetera, things like that. So as we look at a church budget as a group, and as Baptists, when we have congregational authority, then we as a group, that's one of the things we have to look at is how are we allocating our money, how are we spending our money, and are we doing it to fulfill the Great Commission and the commandment to love one another and minister, or are we just worried about making sure that we have the things that we want? Number 6, inordinate demands for pastoral care. This is a hard one because it hurts me, because as a pastor, right, I don't ever want to be accused of neglecting a member. And there's been some times where I thought, oh man, I really messed up. I should have talked to them or whatever. But at the same time, as a church member, you also are called to minister to one another, right? It's love one another, not pastor love everybody. So a lot of times the pastor, to help with this, because as numbers increase, there's just not enough time in the day, not enough time in the week for the pastor to meet with everybody. So then that's where deacons can come along and help. This is where Sunday school teachers or small group teachers can come along and help. There are some churches that they'll do like a pastoral care ministry type thing where people are assigned either elderly or what have you to meet the needs of what's going on. So it becomes a team effort, and so that way nobody is neglected. The name just escapes me, but there was one pastor who told his congregants that if I visit you in the hospital, you should know something's terribly wrong. It was just because his church was massive, and so he didn't always get to meet everybody. So typically, if he was meeting them, it's because they were on death's doorstep, and so which at that point, I don't think I'd want him to meet me. If I'm in the hospital and he showed up, I'd be like, "Nah, you're gonna have to leave because I'm not ready yet." Right? Anyway, that's a joke. Anyway. Number 7, attitudes of entitlement. And he says this one's a catch-all, and he's right. I mean, that's the whole idea here, right? The attitude of, I'm entitled to what I want. And I'll take it back to generations. Being in between, I get to make fun of both of them, right? But boomers and millennials, they have this in common. They both think they're entitled. And somebody's going to get mad that I said that, and that's okay. You can get mad. Because that's a human thing, right? I mean, my generation's the same way. The generations coming up the same way. We always think we're the special ones, and we always think that what we want is best, and the world revolves around us. That is a human nature thing, and the Bible calls that sin, which we're supposed to repent of. So the attitude of entitlement, it's all over. We just pick on certain groups because it's more fun that way. But the overarching attitude is one of demanding and having a sense of deserving special treatment. If you go into your church thinking I should be treated special because of X, right? Then that is completely against the gospel. Because who did Christ die for? He died for all. Did he die for the righteous? Well, no, because there's none that are righteous. Did we earn our salvation? Does God look upon us and say, man, they are such worthy creatures, I must save them? No, that's the opposite of the gospel. And when we reflect on what Christ has done for us, it draws us into humility. And so the aspect of pride and I should get what I want because I'm special, that goes out the window the more we focus on Christ. So churches that are dying because of this inward focus, because of this attitude of entitlement, then it's because they've lost sight of the gospel. They've lost their first love. Number 8, greater concern about change than the gospel, right? Almost any noticeable changes in the church evoke the ire of many, but those same passions are not evident about participating in the work of the gospel to change lives. If there's one paragraph you should highlight, it's that one. There's this notion of, well, so-and-so's coming in and they're trying to change everything. One, I would argue nobody's ever really trying to change everything. If the way somebody's wanting to change everything is if they're talking about like rebuilding a building, reconstituting, and in all honesty, there are churches that exist today. They need to do that. They need to have that bulldozer plow through them and just replant and restart. I don't think that's a lot, although I haven't looked at statistics, so I couldn't tell you. But I know what every church needs, and a lot of churches for sure, like especially needed, but every church needs is this focus on the gospel mission and the Great Commission. So greater concern about change than the gospel. What is the gospel? What is it calling us to? What are the implications for my life? And furthermore, how can I spread that gospel and make it known to the people around me? That is the priority. Not the building, not the programs, not anything else. The priority is how do we reach our loved ones, our neighbors, our friends, the ones we don't love, right? The ones we kind of get annoyed with. How do we reach that multitude of people with the gospel of Christ? And then number 9, anger and hostility. Members are consistently angry. They regularly express hostility toward the church staff and other members. So I've not seen this yet. I have heard stories. So I would argue this, right? As you're reflecting on this chapter and looking back at your own dealings and your own conversations with people in the church, have you seen this in yourself? Have you seen it with others? And when we recognize that anger has been an issue, and even if the person you were angry with is no longer part of your church, you should still seek forgiveness. It goes back to previous chapters, right? That we have to forgive one another, and whatever it is that we were angry about, maybe we can work it out, maybe we can't. We do, but at the end of the day, we still have to forgive each other. Ask for forgiveness. And I would encourage you that if this is you, if you read this and you're going through this book and you realize that you have had the wrong attitude and you've made that attitude known publicly or with enough people that it might as well be publicly, then you probably should seek public forgiveness. Even if it was a long time ago, right? There is no harm, and it's actually a great encouragement to others, and it is a great witness to Christ. And it will be freeing for your own soul and your own conscience if you just ask for forgiveness and just say, look, I messed up. Even if it was 10, 20 years ago, you just say, look, I messed up. I need you guys to forgive me, and I want to do better. I guarantee you it will go over way better than you think it will. Because here's the thing about God's people, all right? Not church people, God's people. God's people want to forgive. And if you have been angry or you sinned against one of God's people, they're going to be right there ready to forgive you. Because what's cool about God is he's not just working in your heart, he's already working in theirs too. And the moment you ask for forgiveness, God has already been preparing them to forgive you. And if they're unwilling to forgive you, that's between them and God at that point. So go for it. Last one, though, is evangelistic apathy. And this again, it kind of goes with a lot of them, but more concerned about their own needs rather than the greatest eternal needs of the world and community in which they live. I don't know how else to say it. Like, we are here as a church to do two things. We are to glorify God and to help others do the same thing. And in glorifying God, one of the ways we do that is by helping others do the same thing. Right? By proclaiming the message of Christ and living out the message of Christ and the good news and the gospel and the transformation power of the gospel, by living that out, we are glorifying God. By holding that in, by shutting our doors and saying, we can't come out, we're scared, or the government hates us or whatever, by huddling in like a turtle in its shell, we are not glorifying God. It does not glorify God to hide your light under a bushel. I mean, in fact, that's right. The Bible says to let your light shine before men. So we have to do that. And there's no other way around that. And any member who's unwilling to do that, whether individually or as a group, you are outside the boundaries of Christ. That's how that works. All right. Anyway, but he sums it up. You get the picture. I, me, myself, right? The church membership from a biblical perspective is about servanthood. It's about giving. It's about putting others first. And then he goes into the mind of Christ, which is from Philippians 2, which you should definitely read a lot. And then on page 40 at the bottom, I'm going to end with this. He says, my point is that these commandments are not easy. In fact, without God's power, they may prove impossible. That should be rewritten to, without God's power, they are impossible. Because the bottom line that he doesn't say it as openly and bluntly as I would, but that's because he's got a different writing style. That we have to have God transform us. And when we are transformed, then we can live as he's designed us and called us to live. So as you are overwhelmed by Jesus' undeserved love for you that caused him to sacrifice everything, including his preferences, you will be able to do the same for others. Now, there is some little bit of a theology issue with that one, but the point still stands, right? What we have to think about as a church member is it's not a country club, so it's not about what I want. It's about what does God want. And the beautiful thing about God and what God has done for us is he's given this thing here called the Bible. And if we will read it and we will study it, then we will know exactly what he's calling us to do. Maybe not in the sense of God says thou shalt have Sunday school at this particular time, but in the sense of loving one another and guiding each other and holding each other accountable. That is very clear. And so that's what we are called to do, and that's what we should do. So this video is a little bit longer, but that's because I think it's so important that we make that transition from me, myself, and I, and what do I want, to what does God want? And if we all, right, as individuals, if we are all pointed and looking towards Christ and what he's called us to do as a church, then we'll walk together in that and we'll grow together in that. And it will be a beautiful thing, and we will grow. We will see, right, because we'll all be bearing fruit, as God calls us to, and we'll see things start to work out as they should, instead of just trying to maintain the walls up or maintaining the status quo. Because at the end of the day, it's not about the status quo. It's about what is Christ calling us to, what is he guiding us to. And in this day and age, with pandemics and et cetera, and all this going on that everybody's sick of talking about, and I agree, I am too. But what has happened in this is that God has put us in a situation that we have to really reflect on what we should be doing as opposed to what we want to be doing. So anyway, God bless. Y'all have a great, wonderful week.